Have you ever wanted to know more about the classic dystopian novel 1984, but you don't have the time or the want to get through it? Well, we're here to help. Welcome to We're Just Here for the Plot, where we analyze books chapter by chapter, then give a brief summary of the full book at the end. Today, we are going through George Orwell's 1984. We have spent weeks reading, researching, and editing to make this the most concise version of 1984, so that you can know what happens at a deeper level in less time. Book 1, Chapter 1. This book begins focusing on a 39-year-old man named Winston Smith. The year is 1984, and the city is set in a futuristic London. London is now a part of the country Oceania, and Winston is a part of the oppressive ruling class called the Party, but he is an insignificant lower-level member. He works in the Ministry of Truth, where he manufactures lies and falsehoods about things, like the news or history. Winston enters his apartment building. As he makes his way up the stairs, he passes posters that say things like, "Big Brother is watching you," and has the face of a large man with a large mustache. Upon entering his apartment, he is barraged by the propaganda being spouted by the telescreen nearby, which is always taking in visual and auditory information in from around it. Winston looks out his window and reflects on the other ministries that take part in the government. The Ministry of Love, which punishes prisoners. The Ministry of Plenty, which provides cheap products for civilian consumption. And the Ministry of Peace, which is in charge of the ever-waging wars. Hidden from the telescreens, Winston begins writing in a diary that he had recently purchased from a lower-class or prole vendor. The proles are so poor and uneducated that the party does not view them as much of a threat, so they are not monitored as closely. As Winston writes, he thinks about his hatred for a dark-haired female co-worker of his, and contemplates the seemingly rebellious look in his other co-workers, O'Brien's, eyes during the ritualistic 2 minutes of hate assembly, with O'Brien's eyes clearly crying out to Winston, "I am with you." Upon looking down at his writing, Winston realizes that he has committed a thought crime, as he has written, over and over again, "Down with Big Brother." There is suddenly a knock at the door. Book 1, Chapter 2. While Winston believes that the knock at his door is the thought police coming to arrest him for his most recent diary entry, Orwell gives us a bait and switch, with the knocker being only his helpless neighbor, Mrs. Parsons. Winston goes to her apartment to help her with her plumbing, but is tormented by her children, who are junior spies for the government, by their constant assault of accusations of a thought crime. Even their mother appears to be afraid of their power. The children berate their mother for not allowing them to view a public hanging. Winston goes back to his apartment, where he has a dream in O'Brien's voice, with it stating, "We shall meet in a place where there is no darkness." Winston continues to write in his diary after that. Book 1, Chapter 3. Winston has some dreams. His first dream is of his mother, who he feels responsible for the disappearance of, on a sinking ship. His next dream is of a place that Winston calls the Golden Country. He dreams of the dark-haired co-worker taking off her clothes as an act of defiance against the party. He eventually wakes up with the word Shakespeare on his mind, though he does not know what that means. He then has to get up to do a round of virtual group exercise called the Physical Jerks, which he hates. While exercising, Winston ponders the lack of photographs and documents he has of his childhood, commenting internally that it makes one lose their own memories. He also thinks of the war with Eurasia and the truthfulness of the so-called alliances that his country has. Abruptly, somebody yells out Winston's name from the telescreen, accusing him of not working out well enough. Winston tries harder. Book 1, Chapter 4. Winston has to go to his job in records at the Ministry of Truth. He works with a voice-to-text machine and works by destroying old pieces of media that are deemed untrue. He makes it so that Big Brother is never wrong. Today, Winston had to alter an old speech that referred to an unperson, or somebody who has become an enemy of the party and was terminated because of that. Winston makes up a new fictitious person, Comrade Ogilvy, and substitutes him in for the unperson. Winston makes him a supreme party member, suspicious and abstinent. Winston reflects on his actions and the idea that every other person in the Ministry of Truth are doing the same deeds that he is. Book 1, Chapter 5. Winston has lunch with his co-worker Syme, who is extremely intelligent and is working on a new revision of the Dictionary of Newspeak, which is basically English but with a lot less words that are deemed dangerous or rebellious. Syme mentions to Winston that Newspeak's goal is to make thought crime impossible by limiting the thoughts that are able to be conveyed. Winston internally comments that Syme will most likely be killed due to his intelligence. Parsons, a forever loyal party member, apologizes for his children's fervor the other day to Winston, who fixed his plumbing while he was away, but he still seemed to be ever so proud of them. Over the loudspeakers, the Ministry of Plenty excitedly announces that there will be an increase of the chocolate ration to 20 grams, even though that it was only yesterday that this ration adjustment was portrayed as a decrease from 30 to 20 grams. Despite this, everybody cheers. Winston notices that the dark-haired girl had been watching him intensely, judging him. Book 1, Chapter 6. Winston recounts his last intimate encounter, which was with an old prole prostitute, in his diary. The party has removed pleasure from these acts and has made it to where it's only procreation for the party. Winston's ex-wife, Catherine, viewed intimacy in this way and left him whenever they found out that they were infertile. Winston desires intimacy with somebody that he is attracted to, as he believes that would be the ultimate act of rebellion. He recognizes the futility of recording this in his diary. Book 1, Chapter 7. Winston continues to write in his diary. He states that any hope of revolution must be in the proles, as they make up the majority of Oceania. But proles lead low-level lives, and often do not see their oppression. Winston flicks through a children's history book, and ponders the candor of it, and the rest of the party's documentation. Winston recalls the time in which he found out a falsehood by the party. Winston saw a group of reformed criminals accused of committing treason in Eurasia, sitting in the Chestnut Tree Cafe. One of them began weeping. A day after that at work, Winston destroyed a photo of them in New York, at the time that they were allegedly committing treason in Eurasia, eliminating the proof of their innocence and proving that the party knew of it, while it was accusing them of the contrary. Winston begins to think of his writings as a kind of love letter to O'Brien, his co-worker, who Winston is sure to be a member of the Brotherhood, the group of resistance fighters against the party. Winston realizes that to be a good party member, one has to deny what one sees and hears, and simply believe what the party tells them. Book 1, Chapter 8. Winston walks through the prole district and tries to glean some history from an old prole, but he does not remember the old days before the party. Winston returns to the store that he bought the diary from, buys a pretty glass paperweight, and the owner takes him up into a room that appears to have no telescreen. When Winston leaves, he notices that the dark-haired girl has been following him. Winston, convinced that the dark-haired girl is a thought police, believes that he has been found out and must commit suicide before the officers can torture him and/or kill him. Winston comforts himself by thinking about O'Brien, talking about the place with no darkness. He stares at a coin from his pocket and thinks of the party's slogans. Book 2, Chapter 1. While at work, Winston has an exchange with the dark-haired girl, who is in a sling and slips to the ground. As Winston helps her up, she discreetly passes him a note. Despite believing that the note may be a trap, he decides to open it and finds it states, "I love you." Winston is, of course, conflicted, as he thought she was a political spy, but is compelled to believe her and has a new sense of purpose. He eventually meets with her amidst a crowd to talk secretly. She gives directions to a place that they can meet later that day that has no telescreens. Book 2, Chapter 2. Winston meets with the girl and learns her name, Julia. She tears off her clothes and they have an affair, nearly identical to his dreams. As they talk afterwards, Winston learns that she has done this multiple times with multiple party members. Winston is overjoyed to hear that other party members are breaking the party's rules. Book 2, Chapter 3. Winston and Julia go back to their daily lives, but meet multiple times and have similar encounters. Winston learns that Julia is not like him. She does not aim for widespread change in the government or society with her rebellion. She simply enjoys having real pleasure and outwitting the thought police. Winston recalls to Julia about a time that he took a walk with his ex-wife Catherine, where he wanted to push her off a cliff, but then claimed that it wouldn't have mattered either way, as oppression would have carried on whether he had done it or not. Book 2, Chapter 4. Winston is in the private room that the shop owner had shown him earlier, which he has now rented for his romantic affair with Julia. Outside the window, Winston notices a red-armed prole woman hanging laundry outside and happily singing loudly. Julia and Winston have been unable to meet as of late, and that makes Winston feel frustrated. Winston imagines a relationship with Julia that is more romantic, like that of an old married couple. Julia comes in with food luxuries that only inner party members can obtain, like real sugar, bread, and coffee. She has makeup on, and she looks extremely beautiful. Later on, while in bed, Julia sees a rat, which Winston has an intense fear of due to an experience from his childhood. Julia and Winston then look at the glass paperweight together and take in its beauty, knowing that it is one thing from the past that they can keep. Book 2, Chapter 5. Syme disappears, just as Winston had predicted earlier. Hate Week is approaching quickly, and preparations are being made for it by the whole city. Winston fantasizes about his ex-wife dying, as that would make marrying Julia a possibility. Winston tells Julia of his bond with O'Brien, despite them never speaking, and how he believes that O'Brien is a part of the Brotherhood. Julia claims that the war and enemies of the party, like Goldstein, are simply fictitious inventions by the party to maintain control. Winston is angered by her lack of concern and insults her accordingly. Book 2, Chapter 6. O'Brien speaks to Winston at the Ministry of Truth in a hallway. Winston is ecstatic, but also nervous. O'Brien implies something about the missing Syme, a thought crime to most, and mentions that Winston could come over to his home to check out an unpublished version of the brand new Newspeak dictionary. Winston accepts his fate that his new path, started by writing in his diary and continued by O'Brien, will land him in the Ministry of Love, where he will eventually die. Book 2, Chapter 7. Winston awakens next to Julia in the private room above the shop, crying. He unleashes a vault of repressed memories. He does recall his childhood, a time after his father had left him, his mother, and his little sister, alone and starving. Winston recounts a time when he was so hungry, he stole his mother and sister's portions of chocolate and ran away for a very long time. By the time that he had returned, his mother and sister were gone, his sister dead. Winston blames himself for killing both his mother and his sister. Winston states that only the proles are still human, as they don't have to repress their emotions in the same way that the party members have to. Julia and Winston admit to each other that they believe that they will be caught, tortured, and admit to crimes that they had committed and more. They hang on to the idea that the party will never stop them from loving each other. Book 2, Chapter 8. Julia and Winston decide that the best course of action for the rebellion is to go straight to O'Brien, who is likely a part of the Brotherhood. They both go to O'Brien's apartment, where O'Brien turns off the telescreen and says that they are safe from the party at the moment. Winston then states to O'Brien that both he and Julia are enemies of the state, and will do anything to join the Brotherhood. O'Brien takes in this information, then tells them that it's all real. The Brotherhood, Emmanuel Goldstein, and the rebellion. Julia eventually leaves. O'Brien gives Winston a book titled The Theory and Practice of Oligarchical Collectivism. Then O'Brien says that he will meet with Winston again. Winston asks if that would be in the place with no darkness, like in his dreams, and O'Brien agrees. As Winston is leaving, he sees O'Brien turn his telescreen back on. Book 2, Chapter 9. Oceania switches its war with Eurasia to East Asia, and the party states that it's always been at war with East Asia, blaming Goldstein for any confusion. Winston continues to read Goldstein's book. The book points out that the inner party, outer party, and the proles are simply the upper class, middle class, and lower class redefined. The book goes on to say that war never progresses, and that is how war is peace translates correctly. Julia shows up, and they listen to the red-armed prole woman sing. They both fall asleep. Book 2, Chapter 10. Winston and Julia are awakened by the sound of the red-armed prole woman singing outside. Winston imagines the fertility of the prole woman, and that she will birth a race of proles that are intelligent enough to fight back against the party. Winston and Julia look at her, then at each other, both saying, "We are the dead." A voice from a telescreen nearby agrees with them. There has been a telescreen hiding behind the picture of St. Clement's Church the whole time. The shopkeep comes in, finishing the rhyme that has been stuck in Winston's head this whole book, though he could not finish it. Winston realizes that the shopkeep, who rented out this room to him, has been a member of the thought police this whole time. Troops come in, beating both Winston and Julia, and breaking the glass paperweight. Winston becomes disoriented and loses touch with reality. Book 3, Chapter 1. Winston wakes up in a brightly lit cell, joined by some faces he recognizes and some that he doesn't, like a large prole woman that may or may not be his mother. Winston hopes that the Brotherhood sends him a razor blade so that he can avoid the torture that lies ahead. These dreams are dashed whenever O'Brien enters the cell, admitting that he is truly allegiant to the party, and that Winston knew this all along, which Winston agrees with. O'Brien then orders the guard to smash Winston's elbow. Book 3, Chapter 2. O'Brien is the overseer of Winston's torture sessions, and Winston slowly starts to love him, which O'Brien deems insane. O'Brien says that the party has perfected the system of torture, and that it has ceased martyrdom by simply destroying the ego of the would-be martyrs. O'Brien offers to answer some questions from Winston. Winston asks him about Julia. Julia betrayed him immediately. Winston asks if Big Brother is real like him, but O'Brien says that he isn't even real. Finally, he asks what's in room 101. O'Brien says that everyone already knows what's in room 101. Book 3, Chapter 3. After several weeks of torture, Winston and O'Brien argue about the veracity of the reality that the party creates. O'Brien then has Winston look into a mirror, where he sees himself as dilapidated, skeletal, gray, causing Winston to weep and blame O'Brien for everything. O'Brien reminds Winston that he brought this all upon himself knowingly. O'Brien acknowledges the love that Winston still has for Julia, which causes Winston to feel love towards O'Brien for this small recognition. O'Brien sets out to cure this. Book 3, Chapter 4. Winston is taken to a more comfortable prison room and is treated much better. He tries to trick himself into believing things, like freedom is slavery, and 2 and 2 make 5, but it never truly takes. One day, while horribly depressed, Winston calls out Julia's name, knowing that this will draw out O'Brien to torture him again. He tells O'Brien that he hates Big Brother, and O'Brien orders him to room 101. Book 3, Chapter 5. Winston is strapped to a chair in room 101 and told that the worst thing in the world is on the other side of that wall. O'Brien reveals that starving rats are caged and ready to eat Winston's face if he does not confess his love for Big Brother and truly believe it. Winston absolutely cracks, screaming for Julia to take his place, subjecting her to his torture and death instead of him. This satisfies O'Brien. Book 3, Chapter 6. Now a free man, Winston sits at the Chestnut Tree Cafe. He now believes that 2 and 2 make 5 and traces it into the dust on his table. He coincidentally meets Julia there and finds her repulsive. They both admit to betraying one another and, despite this, agree to meet later on. Soft music begins to play and Winston begins to sob, as he only remembers false memories. He looks up at a telescreen, at the picture of Big Brother, feeling safe and happy now, thinking to himself, I love Big Brother. Now, for a quick refresh, we open up this story to our protagonist, a 39-year-old man named Winston Smith. Winston is a lower-level party member, the ruling class of this world of 1984. In this world, every citizen is watched by telescreens constantly, and are reminded of it by posters of a mustached man labeled Big Brother is watching you. This story takes place in a futuristic London, now part of the country Oceania, which is currently at war with Eurasia. Oceania is always at war. Winston works at a place called the Ministry of Truth, where all the country's records and media are stored and put out. Winston's specific job is to destroy old pieces of media and rewrite it as if it's always been that way. Winston knows that this is wrong, but continues to do it anyway because of his hopelessness. One day, Winston decides to do a small bit of rebellion. He buys a diary from a lower class or prole vendor and writes in it. He ends up writing some fairly treasonous ideas, but it's all done out of the sight of telescreens. Eventually, Winston comes into contact with a woman named Julia, who he develops a relationship with and falls in love with. They plan to join the resistance force, called the Brotherhood, by talking to a co-worker of Winston's named O'Brien. This ends up backfiring, as O'Brien is a part of the inner party and tricked Winston into thinking that he was a part of the Brotherhood. Both Winston and Julia are taken to the Ministry of Love, where they are tortured, broken, and reconfigured into model citizens. Well, thank you for joining us for We're Just Here for the Plot. I hope you enjoyed this quick summary and analysis of 1984. And if you like this chapter-by-chapter summary, then go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button so that you don't miss another one by us, because we will be covering other classic books. A like and subscribe means a ton to us. We've put so much work and effort into these videos. We spent hours upon hours on them, and I would love to be able to continue to support this amount of effort that we put into it. If you want to delve deeper into 1984, then we are going to be making a couple more videos about it over the next few weeks, covering questions like, how does the manipulation of history affect our perception of it? And also, what do the symbols of 1984 even mean? And more. So please hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss that. And I think that's it for today. So bye!